Chapter 14. Restoration of Industry. One of the most important tasks of the NEP was the creation of the material base of socialism, a powerful advanced machine industry. To do this, the working class must first of all overcome the deepest devastation in all branches of the national economy. The restoration of large-scale industry under these conditions presented great difficulties. It was impossible to take up seriously the restoration of large-scale industry without having the necessary food funds. Lenin referred to the experience of 1920, when the Ivanovo textile industry began to gain momentum, but then the grain and fuel resources were exhausted, and again a hitch in its progress was obtained. For a serious rise in industry, Lenin put forward the task of creating a food fund of 400 million poods of grain. And for this it was necessary to begin with the restoration of the peasant economy. The development of the entire national economy, including industry, rested on agriculture. The rise of agriculture was a prerequisite and necessary condition for the industrial revival of the country. But, in addition to food and agricultural raw materials, fuel and raw materials of mineral origin, or of all kinds, oil for processing, etc., were no less necessary for the restoration of industry. Fuel and raw materials constitute the material basis of the revolving funds of industry. During the Civil War, the discrepancy between the basic and circulating funds of industry reached extreme limits. Not allowing fuel and raw materials problems, it was impossible to think about the restoration of a large industry. In the recovery period, the task was to revive, first of all, agriculture, to get raw materials and food from agriculture, and to set in motion, to restore industry, to restore existing plants and factories. History of the CPSU, B. Short Course, p. 267. At the end of the Civil War, industry was extremely weak. A large number of enterprises, including a number of powerful plants, did not work. It was mothballed. The operating enterprises, with rare exceptions, worked with a partial load. The cash workforce was not fully used. The industry had significant fixed assets, which were idle and were waiting for their revival. The industrial fixed assets of large-scale industry in 1920 were estimated at 8,090 million rubles. In the prices of 1,926.27, in 1921, 7,930 million, in 1922, 7,935 million, in 1923, 7,969 million, in 1924, 8,016 million, and in 1925, 8,105 million rubles. Socialist Construction of the USSR, TSUNHU, 1936, p. 3. In terms of industries that were taken into account in 1913. These data show that during the first year of the NEP the fixed assets of large industry declined, but the following year the further decrease in fixed assets ceased and began to increase. During this period, capital investments were largely directed to capital repairs. In 1923-24, 40%, in 1924-25, 28%, and in 1925-26, 25%. However, the share of capital investments sent to new construction grew rapidly. Thus, the basic production assets were restored relatively quickly. The natural form of fixed assets, factory buildings, equipment, etc., predetermines their use only for their intended purpose and only productive. They cannot become working capital or enter the sphere of individual consumption. The situation is different with the revolving funds. They in their material form, as fuel, lubricants, raw materials, etc., are entirely consumed in the production process and acquire a different natural form. When entering into production, the elements of circulating assets do not retain their independent form in relation to the product they produce. Being exposed to the life-giving effect of labor, they acquire a different material appearance in the finished product. The constituent parts of the circulating funds, wholly consumed in the production process, must be constantly renewed in their previous natural form. The peculiarity of them is also that they can be used for other production and non-production purposes. Coal, intended for metallurgy and for other industries, can be successfully used in transport and for heating homes. The same can happen with metal, with different types of raw materials, which are included in the material elements of working capital. The material form of revolving funds allows their use for a variety of purposes. During the Civil War, the circulating funds of industry were extremely exhausted and did not resume in the necessary form and in the proper quantity. The depletion of circulating assets was caused by a sharp drop in the level of production of the extractive industry, coal, oil, ore, etc., metallurgy, and a catastrophic decline in the collection of industrial crops in agriculture during the Civil War. Meanwhile, without the restoration of revolving funds, there could be no question of restoring industry in general. To raise industrial production at that time, even the question of labor power did not have the acuteness that circulating funds got. Bread for workers, fuel and raw materials for industry were then the main condition for the industrial revival of the country. Of course, the problem of fuel and raw materials is more important in its meaning than the question of the circulating assets of large-scale industry, since fuel goes not only to the needs of industry, but raw materials are also needed for small-scale handicraft industry. However, this does not change the fact that without solving the fuel and raw materials problem, it was impossible to solve the problem of circulating assets of large-scale industry. In the restoration of industry, an exceptional place was occupied by fuel. By the end of the Civil War, the production of those industries that most of all required fuel and raw materials, mainly of mineral origin, had fallen sharply. In the first years of the NEP, the consumption of wood fuel increased significantly. Compared with the pre-war time, coal consumption fell sharply in all sectors of the national economy, even in rail transport, where every transition to less valuable fuels presents great difficulties. In 1913, coal accounted for 62% of all fuel consumed by rail. In 1921-22, the share of coal and fuel consumed by railways fell more than twofold to 27.2%. In 1922-23, it rose to 36.2%, and in 1923-24, up to 51.1%. The consumption of coal in industry fell even more. In 1913, the industry consumed 67.1% of coal and 32.9% of other fuel, mainly firewood, and in 1923-24 the consumption of coal in industry was only 42% of the total amount of fuel consumed. During this period, firewood was delivered to the railway only on peasant horses. Thus, the resolution of the fuel question was closely dependent on the state of agriculture. The extraction of coal, in turn, rested on the food issue. The supply of coal basins with bread largely determined the success in coal mining. In connection with the beginning of the rise in agriculture, state procurements of bakery products increased from year to year. Suffice it to say that in 1925-26 they increased by 133.7% in comparison with 1921-22. The resolution of the food question served as a starting point in particular for solving the fuel problem. In 1921-22, anthracite and hard coal were produced at 11.224 million tons. In 1922-23, 12.7 million. In 1923-24, 16,328,000. In 1924-25, 16,520,000. And in 1925-26, 25,770,000 tons. The reserves of raw materials, primarily agricultural raw materials, grew. The collection of technical crops has been systematically increasing. In 1925-26, as a whole, according to Technical Cultures, the country almost reached the pre-war level of production. Raw cotton in 1925-26 was collected in comparison with the pre-war level of 89.4%, flax fiber, 83.8%, hemp fiber, 112.4%, oilseeds, 137.1%, tobacco yellow, 164.7%, macorca, 173.9%, etc. From these figures it can be seen that in many industrial crops the gross output of agriculture in 1925-26 exceeded the pre-war size. The raw material base of the food industry was in the most favorable condition. Worse was the case with raw materials of mineral origin. The production of oil without gas amounted to 7,483,000 tons in 1925, or 81% in relation to production in 1913. Iron ore, 2,190,000 tons or 23.8% of production in 1913. From these data it follows that the level of fuel production and raw materials of mineral origin significantly lagged behind the size of the production of agricultural raw materials. The raw material base of the light and food industries was restored in a shorter period than the raw material base of the heavy industry. This to a certain extent explains the backwardness of heavy industry in the first years of NEP. The interests of lifting heavy industry demanded an accelerated recovery of its raw materials base. The metal industry, which is the basis of heavy industry, began to tighten the iron ore industry by the end of the recovery period. Only in 1925 ore mining increased more than twofold. The financial policy of the proletarian state was also subordinated to the task of strengthening the circulating assets of large-scale industry. The all-round rise of industries that produce fuel and raw materials for industry and transport. Particular attention was paid to the financing of the extractive industry. The gross output of the extractive industry for 1921-22 was estimated at 194.5 million pre-war rubles, and the manufacturing industry in 1,298.7 million pre-war rubles. The output of the extractive industry in the same year was 13% of the gross output of large-scale industry. In the following year, 1922-23, the gross output of the extractive industry was estimated at 219.2 million, and the processing industry, 1,730.1 million pre-war rubles. The share of output of the extractive industry decreased to 11.3%. From the end of 1921 to May 1922, the industry was allocated about 30 million rubles. Gold, with 45% of this amount went to the fuel industry and about 25% to the metal. In 1922-23, the extractive industry received 61,035.3 thousand rubles from the state, or 43.6% of all budget allocations of industry. Thus, the extractive industry, the share of which in all industrial output is small, received the lion's share of state appropriations. The increased financing of this branch of industrial production was dictated by the need for an early expansion of the raw material base of large-scale industry. The credit granted to industry in 1922-23 was used mainly to replenish working capital. In the same year, a large loan, 21.5 million rubles, was received through the State Bank of the textile industry for the purchase of foreign cotton. In 1921-22, 15,000 poods of cotton were imported from abroad, 258,000 poods of tannic substances, 85,000 poods of rubber, and so on. In 1922-23, cotton was imported 1828,000 poods, tannins, 1275,000 poods in rubber, 165,000 poods. All these figures show how important the Soviet government attached to restoring the circulating assets of large-scale industry at that time and what measures it took to resolve this problem. In 1921, the output of large-scale industry enterprises was about 5 times lower than the pre-war level, while the number of workers employed in it was only half that in 1913. The output per worker in 1921 was 2.12 times less than the output of one worker in 1913. In the first years of the NEP in large enterprises, there were undoubtedly great shortcomings in the field of organization and discipline of labor. However, this alone cannot account for the large drop in labor productivity, the main cause of which was the acute shortage of food, as well as fuel and raw materials for industry. The low level of labor productivity in turn affected the cost of production. The reduction in the cost of production of large-scale industry was directly dependent on the resolution of food, fuel and raw materials. Without this, the full burden of enterprises and a serious increase in labor productivity were unthinkable. The beginning of the rise of agriculture, the growth of the country's food, fuel and raw materials have ensured a rapid increase in the circulating assets of large-scale industry and an increase in the workload of enterprises. The necessary prerequisites and conditions were created for the restoration of large-scale industry. Factories received the necessary fuel and raw materials, workers, bread and other food products. But in order to realize these conditions, the heroic efforts of the working class and its labor enthusiasm were needed. During this period the working class quickly consolidated its ranks. Workers began to return to factories and plants. For 5 years, from 1921 to 1925, the number of workers in the factory industry increased by 64%, from 1,185,000 to 2,107,000, or 81.1% of the 1913 workers. It is characteristic that the output of large-scale industry for this time has increased from 2,004 million rubles. For comparison, since 1913, the data in the text are given without the production of the fishing industry, logging and railway repair shops. The diagram shows the gross output of large-scale industry for a full range of industries to 7,739 million rubles. In the prices of 1,926.27, that is, almost fourfold. In comparison with 1921, the output per worker in 1925 more than doubled, from 5.7 rubles. For one spent man day it increased to 11.9 rubles. The average annual output of one worker in 1913 was 3,944 rubles, and in 1925, 3,673 rubles, i.e. 93.2% of the pre-war level. Thanks to the great work done by the party of Lenin and Stalin in organizing and educating the working masses, the Leninist slogan of raising labor productivity was successfully implemented. Labor discipline was strengthened. The number of working days increased from 221.5 in 1921 to 261.9 in 1925, that is, by 18.2%. Walks for disrespectful reasons decreased from 20.6 to 7.4 days per year on average per worker. Improved organization in the work of enterprises. The political and productive activity of the working class grew. His labor enthusiasm was a powerful engine for the industrial recovery of the country. The advanced workers were the pioneers in the movement for a regime of economy and the rationalization of production. A special role at that time was played by industrial meetings of workers at enterprises. Production meetings consisted mainly of workers from the machine tool. The members of the factory committee and representatives of the administration took part in them. The meetings educated the productive assets of enterprises and involved the broad masses of workers in active participation in socialist construction. The great fundamental importance of the work of the production meetings was that here the working masses, while solving specific questions of production, learned the state approach to the economy. They brought up a communist attitude to work and the people's property. From the asset of the production meetings, subsequently, many fine business executives and administrators grew up. Guided by the Leninist plan for the restoration of industry, starting with agriculture, solving the food problem on this basis, and then, the raw material problem, the working class of our country from the very beginning of NEP ensured high rates of industrial growth of the country. Large-scale industry began to recover quickly, its gross output increased significantly every year. In 1925, it reached 7,739 million rubles. In the prices of 1,926.27 against 10,251 million rubles. In 1913, in comparable terms, and in 1926 already surpassed the level of pre-war industrial production by 8.1%. For comparison, since 1913, the data in the text are given without the production of the fishing industry, logging and railway repair shops. The diagram shows the gross output of large-scale industry for a full range of industries. See diagram number 1. Diagram 1. The gross output of large-scale industry, in billions of rubles, in the prices of 1,926.27. In the 5 years of the recovery period, industrial production increased 5.12 times. The rise of a large socialist industry occurred much faster than the growth of small-scale handicraft industry. In 1920, the industrial output of the large socialist industry exceeded the gross output of the handicraft industry by only 24%, and in 1924-25 it was 315% higher. Lenin's electrification plan was successfully implemented. The work of power plants has significantly improved, their number and average size of enterprises have increased. In 1925, in comparison with 1921, the output of power plants increased almost sixfold, surpassing pre-war dimensions. All the country's power plants in 1925 produced 2,925 million kWh against 1945 million kWh in 1913. Significant investments were made for that time in the state industry. In 1923-24, the amount of capital investments in industry amounted to 245.3 million rubles, in 1924-25, 395.3 million, and in 1925-26, 858.3 million rubles. 1923-24 without housing construction, and the remaining years with proms have on them, in the prices of the corresponding years. During these 3 years, about 1.5 billion rubles were invested in the socialist industry. Let us cite some summary data on the dynamics of the growth of output of large, censored industry. Production of large-scale industry of the USSR, Socialist Construction of the USSR, TSUNHU, 1936, p2. By industry, accounted for in 1913, without the fish industry, logging, timber floating and repair railroad workshops,